Mr. Wellington, she began, her courtroom voice filling the space effortlessly. I've reviewed the HOA covenant in detail, along with state statutes governing homeowners associations and relevant case law. Wellington's smile remained fixed, though his eyes narrowed slightly. Ms. Mercer, we appreciate your interest, but I assure you our bylaws are legally sound. That's Justice Mercer, corrected Mrs. Patel from the front row. Wellington's smile faltered. I'm sorry. My proper title is Justice Mercer, Eleanor said calmly. But tonight, I'm simply a homeowner who, along with 26 others present, has been subjected to selective enforcement of improperly ratified bylaws. She proceeded to outline, with devastating precision, the legal deficiencies in Wellington's reign of terror. She projected documentation showing the board had never properly voted on the landscaping restrictions. She displayed side-by-side comparisons of Wellington's unpermitted pool house alongside Ms. Abernathy's fine garden gnome collection. Furthermore, she continued as Wellington's face progressed from pink to crimson. The pattern of enforcement demonstrates clear discrimination based on age, gender, and in some cases, ethnicity, all documented here. She held up a bound report. Copies are available for all residents and have been filed with the State Attorney General's office and the Housing Authority. Wellington slammed his gavel. This is outrageous. You can't just waltz in here and make accusations. She just did, interrupted Catherine from beside the projector. And as a forensic accountant, I've identified some concerning patterns in the HOA financial records that merit further investigation. Specifically, the landscaping company that received a no-bid contract last year appears to be owned by your brother-in-law. The room erupted. Wellington banged his gavel uselessly as residents shouted questions and demands for his resignation. Eleanor simply stood at the microphone, calm amid the chaos. When Wellington's eyes met hers across the room, she gave him a small, almost sympathetic smile. She'd seen more intimidating opponents in her courtroom every day. The story made the local news first. Supreme Court Justice takes HOA to school. Within days, it had been picked up by national outlets. Highest court meets lowest form of governance. Justice Mercer versus HOA president. Eleanor ignored the media frenzy, declining all interview requests. She had actual Supreme Court cases to focus on after all. But she did make time to host a garden party for her neighbors, setting up tables among her controversial roses. To new beginnings, she toasted, raising a glass of lemonade toward the freshly elected HOA board. Wellington had resigned the morning after the confrontation, and a special election had installed a diverse group of 5 residents, including Mrs. Patel and Mr. Jimenez. And to Heritage Roses, added Sylvia, who had been named the community's first gardening ambassador, tasked with helping residents develop environmentally friendly landscaping. The new board had already voted to refund all fines issued during Wellington's tenure, and had established a legal review committee to ensure all bylaws complied with state and federal law. Eleanor had politely declined a position on that committee, citing her day job, but had offered to provide reference materials. As residents mingled in her garden, Eleanor slipped away to take a call from her clerk. Justice Mercer, the Chief Justice wants to know if you're planning to recuse yourself from the HOA regulatory case coming up next term, Miguel said. Eleanor laughed. Tell him I've gained some valuable perspective on the issue, but no recusal necessary. My personal experience only underscores the constitutional principles at stake. After the call, she returned to find Catherine deep in conversation with the new HOA president, a retired civil rights attorney, about establishing a community legal aid clinic for housing issues. You've started something here, Catherine said as Eleanor rejoined them. Not just for Oakwood Estates. Eleanor shrugged, but couldn't hide her satisfaction. She bent to clip a perfect Justice Eternal bloom and handed it to a young girl who had been admiring the roses. My mother always said that true justice, like gardening, requires both patience and decisive action, she told the child. Sometimes you nurture, sometimes you prune. Later that evening, as the last guests departed, Eleanor's phone pinged with an email from an unfamiliar address. It was from Wellington, a surprisingly gracious note acknowledging his mistakes and thanking her for not pursuing legal action against him personally. He'd accepted a job in another state and was reconsidering his approach to community involvement. The law library at 2 a.m. was Eleanor's natural habitat. While her clerk slept, she prowled between the stacks in jeans and an old Harvard sweatshirt, her reading glasses perched on her nose. The security guard had stopped questioning her late-night appearances years ago. HOAs and constitutional limits on private governance, she murmured, trailing her fingers along leather-bound spines. She pulled volumes down with practiced precision, creating neat stacks on a massive oak table. By dawn, she had compiled enough ammunition to nuke Wellington's fine into oblivion, but that wasn't her style. Eleanor believed in surgical strikes, not carpet bombing. She called her clerk Miguel as she drove home. "Cancel my lunch with the Attorney General. I need you to pull every property record for Oakwood Estates going back 10 years. And get me satellite imagery of all properties, focusing on landscaping changes." "New case, Justice Mercer?" Miguel asked, confusion evident in his voice. "No, Miguel. This is personal." She hung up before he could ask questions. By midday, her dining room looked like a war room. Property records covered one wall, tax assessments another. Her sister Catherine, a forensic accountant, whistled as she entered. "When you called and said you needed help with a minor property dispute, I didn't expect this." Catherine gestured at the explosion of documents. "Wellington's been selectively enforcing bylaws," Eleanor explained, pushing a spreadsheet toward her sister. "Notice anything?" Catherine scanned it, her eyebrows rising. "He's only targeting properties owned by single women and elderly residents, and the fine amounts are significantly higher for them." "Exactly. And look at his own property modifications." Eleanor pointed to satellite images showing a massive pool house addition to Wellington's Colonial. "No permits, no HOA approval." Catherine laughed. "He picked the wrong rose garden to trample." Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Sylvia, an 83-year-old retired librarian. Another red envelope. $900 for unapproved bird feeders. "I can't afford this, Ellie." Eleanor's jaw tightened. This just became a class action. The quarterly HOA meeting was usually attended by the same 7 retirees, plus whoever had recently been fined. Tonight, the community center conference room was standing room only, with residents spilling into the hallway. Eleanor had arrived early, setting up her materials methodically at the back of the room. She wore a simple black dress rather than anything that screamed federal judiciary. Her plan wasn't to intimidate with her title, but to dismantle Wellington with facts. Wellington strutted in 5 minutes late, flanked by 2 board members who looked uncomfortable with the unexpected turnout. He adjusted his bow tie, who wore a bow tie to an HOA meeting, and called the meeting to order. "Before we begin regular business, I'll allow 15 minutes for resident concerns," he announced magnanimously, checking his Rolex. Eleanor let 3 other residents speak first. Mrs. Patel described being fined for Diwali decorations that remained up 1 day past the acceptable holiday decoration period. Mr. Jimenez detailed how his son's basketball hoop had been deemed aesthetically incongruent with neighborhood recreational standards. When Eleanor finally approached the microphone, the room fell silent. Those who recognized her nudged their neighbors. Justice Eleanor Mercer kicked off her heels with a satisfying thud against her foyer wall. The Supreme Court had just finished hearing arguments on a contentious interstate water rights case, and her brain felt as parched as the disputed reservoirs. She flipped through her mail mechanically until a crimson envelope with gold embossing caught her eye. The Oakwood Estates logo gleamed under her pendant lights, almost taunting me. "What now?" she muttered, slicing it open with her monogrammed letter opener, a gift from Ruth Bader Ginsburg when Eleanor had been appointed to the court 5 years ago. Inside was a notice so absurd she nearly laughed aloud. Marcus Wellington Ailey, the newly elected HOA president, who never failed to use all 3 numerals of his name, had fined her $750 for her unauthorized botanical installation, the heritage rose garden she'd planted after her mother's funeral 3 months ago. The letter dripped with condescension, Perhaps as a busy professional, you overlooked the requirement for advanced approval of all visible landscaping elements. As stewards of property values, we cannot allow such flagrant disregard for community standards. Eleanor's amusement curdled into anger. Her mother had been a renowned botanist who specialized in heritage roses. The garden was filled with rare varieties that her mother had cultivated throughout her career, some named after her. The garden wasn't just flowers, it was a living memorial. She poured herself 2 fingers of bourbon, another gift, this one from a colleague after her landmark opinion on tribal sovereignty, and stepped onto her back porch. The evening light bathed the roses in gold, the heady scent filling the air. Her mother's favorite, a velvety crimson bloom called Justice Eternal, had just opened that morning. Eleanor sipped her drink, a plan already forming. Marcus Wellington II had no idea who he was dealing with, not just a Supreme Court justice, but the daughter of the woman who'd successfully sued 3 different government agencies to protect endangered plant species. Mom would have loved this fight, she whispered to the roses as twilight deepened around her. Eleanor set her glass down on the porch railing and pulled out her phone. Scrolling through her contacts, she tapped on Catherine and waited for her sister to answer. "Please tell me you're calling to say you'll finally take a vacation," Catherine answered. "Not exactly," Eleanor replied, walking among her roses. "Remember Marcus Wellington? That investment banker who bought the Hendersons' old place last year? The one with the yacht photos as his profile picture on the neighborhood website? That's the one. He's become the HOA president and just fined me $750 for Mom's roses." Catherine's laughter filled the speaker. "Oh, Ellie, poor man has no idea what he's done, does he?" "Not yet," Eleanor confirmed, brushing her fingers along a delicate pink bloom called Memory's Embrace. "I need you to do some digging for me, discreetly." As a financial crimes prosecutor for the Justice Department, Catherine had access to databases that would make most investigators drool. The sisters had always been formidable separately, but together they were nearly unstoppable, a fact their mother had both celebrated and occasionally feared. "You know this is technically an abuse of my position," Catherine said, but Eleanor could hear keyboards clacking in the background already. "Think of it as research for potential patterns of discriminatory housing practices," Eleanor suggested. "Besides, Wellington strikes me as the type who has something to hide." After hanging up, Eleanor retrieved her bourbon and settled into a porch chair, pulling a throw blanket around her shoulders as the evening cooled. From her vantage point, she could see several of her neighbors' houses, including Wellington's ostentatious colonial, with its newly installed columns that were definitely not period appropriate. A text from Catherine interrupted her thoughts. Initial search interesting. Ding has 3 previous HOAs on his resume, all left after disagreements with the board. Also, his pool house definitely exceeds county size restrictions. More tomorrow. Eleanor smiled. The Constitution might be her professional expertise, but her mother had taught her that sometimes justice started in your own backyard. She finished her bourbon as full darkness fell, the motion sensor lights illuminating her garden pathways. Tomorrow, she'd be back at the court, weighing complex federal questions. But tonight, she was just a homeowner with a grudge and significant resources.